All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to support and inspire new trauma therapists just starting out on the trauma-informed journey. I do that with my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0, my online courses and workshops, and the Trauma Therapist newsletter. If you're a therapist of any kind and you work with individuals who've been impacted by trauma, I invite you to head on over to my website at thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. All right, let's get started. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am very excited to have my guest today, Sasha Cuff. Sasha, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. So Sasha is a loving father of 3 boys, ages 22, 18, and 12. Holy moly, we got to talk about that later. He says that children have taught him much more about therapy than he ever learned in any psychology class. He started sitting therapeutically with people 25 years ago. In the early days, he used muscle testing, flower remedies, and guidance from the spirit world to support people wanting better health. Over the first 15 years of his practice, he observed that some people got better, but many people were not getting much better at all. For 25 years, he searched for the roots of suffering and disease. Over those years, he studied Chinese medicine, Ayurveda, energy healing, among other modalities. 7 years ago, he became a relational somatic therapist through Mariah Moser's Relational Somatic Therapy course, Opening to Grace. And between that and parenting, he's thrilled to claim that he's found the Holy Grail of healing. Most of what he practices and teaches now, he did not learn it through school. Rather, he learned it through sitting with people in the trenches for 25 years, not knowing what he was doing, but sitting there with the earnest desire to get to the bottom of it all. All right, Sasha, welcome, man. Before we get going, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
I grew up in Vancouver, Canada, in British Columbia, and now I'm in Caslow, British Columbia.
Okay.
Tiny little town up in the mountains of BC.
Okay, awesome.
Now, where are you?
I'm in Bend, Oregon.
Okay, nice.
Yeah. Now, what is not in that bio is your interest in psychedelics.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, which we're going to talk about. And let's start off here. Let's get there, but let's first start off by sharing with us how the heck you got into this field in the first place, in this desire to work with people, sit with people.
Yeah, it started off actually when my first son was born, and he had, what they called colic, and he kind of screamed for about 2 years fairly consistently. And of course we tried everything, diet and energy workers and shamans and doctors and naturopaths, and nothing worked, until, out of desperation, I started muscle testing, and I thought maybe I could get some guidance, and he tested for cranial sacral, and we did the cranial sacral thing, and it was birth trauma. I think a lot of what they call colic is actually birth trauma. Because the doctors was like, okay, well, where does colic come from? Oh, it just means fussy baby. Well, what's the cause? Oh, well, we don't really know. So that was where it kind of sparked, like, oh, trauma was causing unprocessed.
How did you discover that? How was it?
Well, the cranial sacral, he had a really long birth. It went on for 3 days. It was a home birth, and it just, like, the sun kept coming up and going down, and he came out, his head was like a rugby ball, and no one out of all the people we saw suggested it might have been birth trauma. But then when the cranial sacral did his head, it was like, oh yeah, and then he stopped just like that. No more screaming.
Oh my gosh.
So all of a sudden that was one light going on, that trauma might be at the root of some things, and then also the muscle testing worked. Got the right modality. So that's kind of what sparked me getting really curious about healing.
Okay. So this was what, 20 some odd years ago?
Yeah,
25?
he's 22 now. No, he's 23 now, but yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what happens? What do you do? What unfolds? How do you actionalize that, in a sense?
Like in a session now, you mean? Or?
No. Well, how did you got really interested in working with people? What did you go to school? Did you go back to school? Or
I see what you mean. Yeah. Well, I started I mean, it was a very eclectic mix of, just taking different courses, like, oh, I'm interested in energy work, so I'll take that, or I'm interested in shamanism, so I'll, find somebody that does that. And, there was a woman, Nelson, so I went and sort of apprenticed with her for a bit, and, just kind of learned things along the way that I was interested in, and then just kept incorporating it into my practice and sitting with people. There's each modality has something, it's so rich, Chinese medicine and Ayurveda, all these things, they all have, something to offer to the healing arts. And I did do a little bit of, psychology classes in, college, and, but it just didn't feel quite right. Like it felt like they were missing something. And so I didn't pursue that too far. I got a few counseling tools and stuff that helped me in my practice just for sitting with people. But I wasn't seeing much resolution from just kind of understanding what was going on a psychological level. So, I just kept seeking, at the same time as I was quite a seeker sort of on the spiritual path as well. I really wanted to know like what God is and what truth is and what I am and what's the, reality and all of that. So I was also pursuing a lot of spiritual paths at the same time.
Now, do you, at that time and currently, do you identify as a healer? It doesn't sound like you're a licensed therapist.
No, I did have I was an RTC for a while, which is a registered therapeutic counselor. So I did jump through enough hoops to get a counseling degree. But once I started practicing, bringing psychedelics into my practice, then I was outside of their scope of what they would cover. So I dropped that designation.
Okay. Yeah. And so do you identify as a healer?
I wouldn't call myself a healer. I would, I'm the guy that's creating the optimal conditions for someone's inner healer to do what it needs to do.
So more of a guide.
I'm a facilitator. Of people, investigating themselves, and I'm really curious with, like what's going on inside. Oh, it feels really, cool. Let's like explore that together. So I'm just this fascinated friend, really, that cares a lot and is wants to get to the bottom of whatever's going on and will hang in there with you.
Okay. So people who comes to see you?
All walks of life, from teenagers to 80-year-old people. It used to be mainly women in my practice, and in the past couple of years it's almost balanced out, women to men, which I find really inspiring. It's like finally the dudes are starting to realize that the cultural conditioning hasn't been very helpful for happy life, and they're looking for alternatives. So that's I'm excited about. I also do men's work too. I'm in a couple of men's groups and then facilitate men's medicine work, which I find fascinating as well.
So, I mean, it sounds like obviously you have a really rich background, an extensive background in different healing modalities. So walk us through, and I realize it's going to be different for each person, but walk us through, give us an example of someone who comes to see you and how you might work with them to the point where maybe you start introducing or psychedelics are introduced.
Yeah. So people come, we do a few sessions, and usually it's kind of like with the somatic therapy, right? You're kind of going in and it's like a guided mindfulness practice where people, if they're feeling their body and they're starting to feel the places where the trauma is arising, and depending on, there's multiple factors, I might recommend doing a psychedelic session, kind of down the road. It's hard to jump right into a psychedelic session. Of course, you want to really build safety with people because it's very vulnerable, and it's like a 7-hour session, and people need to feel, the safer that people feel, the deeper they can go. So we always do a few sessions at least first, and then depending on how stable they are, and we might do we would start with an pathogen assisted session first, like MDMA or 3-MMC. And the nice thing about those ones is you don't lose agency. It's, like some of the plant medicines like mushrooms and ayahuasca, you really can get really disoriented. Mm-hmm. So they're not the best ones to start with. I often suggest people start with, because the empathogens, they just basically just make you feel really good. You get a bunch of serotonin and you feel really pleasant. And it's much easier to go into, childhood trauma and stuff when you're feeling good. If you're already feeling crappy, and then, right. let's look at your childhood trauma together, and they're like, so the medicines really help. Like, yeah, we can do that, and help them drop into those traumatic imprints.
And do you only introduce or invite a client to work with psychedelics or an pathogen in the context of trauma?
I would say like 90% of it is trauma related. I didn't realize till actually the last couple of years how much of an epidemic unprocessed trauma is. Like when you start studying developmental trauma and attachment trauma and ancestral trauma and vicarious trauma and birth trauma, and it actually is underlying, I would say about 90% of our ailments, and the psychology is more the symptoms of unprocessed trauma, right? So what that whole field of psychology is sort of like symptom management, right? But again, it's not addressing, it doesn't necessarily resolve anything, because it's not actually, where's that crazy thinking coming from? It's usually coming from some unprocessed anxiety that's just, looping in thought. So, until you start going into the body and processing I'd like to say, we're not stuck in our psychology, we're stuck in our biology. And it's when you get into the biology that then, trauma starts to resolve, and then your mind settles down and you feel less crazy and less confused and less disoriented. And
one of the reasons why I wanted you to come on here is to talk about psychedelics. I've had a number of people come on the show to talk about it. It's getting a lot of traction. More articles are being written on it. More studies are being done on its efficacy and so forth. And yet it does at this point kind of remain kind of on the fringes or outside the bounds of what normal therapeutic practice and so forth. But walk us through, if you can, how psychedelics might address and help someone process trauma. Why psychedelics? Why not, I don't know, something, why not somatic therapy or something else?
Yeah, well, for me, it's really the combination of the therapy with the medicine that is the real magic. It's kind of like a match made in heaven. You like these empathogens, they increase the salience of positive resources and decrease the fear centers, and also like it inhibits shame, so that people actually start talking about all these, I've never told anyone this before. They're all their deepest, darkest secrets. I tell people before, like, it's really common that you'll take this medicine and then you'll start telling me your deepest, darkest secrets that you've never told anyone. And, I've heard it all. So, it's welcome, bring it on. No judgment in any of the, so because that inhibition gets lessened, it's much easier for people to go into more vulnerable places of like, I'm really fucking scared. And it makes the protectors become more obvious somehow. And especially with this one called 3-MMC, it unencapsulates implicit imprints. So very early ones too. So I work a lot with early developmental trauma. So a lot of what I'm doing in a session is people start feeling the fear and alone, and like, okay, yeah, just go into that. And then from that, just reach your hand out, and then I grab their hand and they pull me in, and we co-regulate. and I'm using my nervous system to like
Mhm.
entrain with them, and we might do that 20 times in a session if the developmental trauma is high. So because there's that imprint of I'm alone and I'm scared and nobody's coming, right? Because we have this
Mhm.
cry it out method that is ridiculous. And so a lot of people have these really early implicit imprints, but those are really hard, like in a regular, normal somatic therapy session. Okay, just like see if you can go into the fear of the baby being alone. And people are kind of like, maybe, I don't know. But with the medicine, they're just like, boom, they just come up, and it just keeps serving up the next layer of whatever it is. And yeah, so they're highly beneficial when you combine them with somatic therapy. If you
Right.
just took it in a room by yourself, you'd feel good, but no big transformation necessarily would happen.
And as you said, these sessions can take what, hours?
Yeah, the
Or at least,
medicine session's typically about 7 to 8 hours
which
long.
is a crazy long period of time.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
So you're obviously in there, you're facilitating this, you're guiding that person through that time.
Hmm.
What happens at the end? What does it look like? I mean, I realize this is not easy to talk about so much. For me, it's not easy to understand and talk about, but how does healing happen? Does it happen at the end when you're quote unquote processing this, or each point along the way?
Yeah, it's happening sort of layer by layer by
Yeah,
layer all the way through. And sometimes people just need to talk and be heard. And
right.
it's like the little boy is like, oh, no one's ever really listened to me for this long
Yeah.
before, and they're really excited and they just want to like tell you everything about their life. And so I think that's helpful to all this unprocessed stuff, but it's not necessarily making huge transformations in their the way their body's holding trauma or anything like that. But it takes the lid off of it, because that's also building trust. Like, wow, somebody listened
Mm-hmm.
to me for like 4 hours nonstop, and now I can go deeper because the relational piece has been like really established. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and then at the end of the session, it can be challenging sometimes, because depending, like particularly with people that have deep attachment trauma, it's basically often with the in pathogens, it's a co-therapy team. So it's usually like a male and a female and then the client. So
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of like you have the idealized parents
Mm-hmm.
there for 7 hours, like loving you consistently for whatever's coming up. And then when it's time to leave, their attachment stuff, like if they have anxious
Mm.
attachment or something, it's all of a sudden like they're being abandoned. Like, oh, I had 2 loving parents like fully paying attention to me that's never happened before, and now I got to go home and be alone. And they have a hard time. So I often set it up like, can you have a friend come and pick you up that can stay with you overnight? And we even have like aftercare people. You can hire somebody to come and just feed you dinner, and just so that you don't have to like shift so quickly out of that deep early processing into like, I have to be an adult again, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So because some people, it's easier to, you want to kind of ease them out of it. And yeah.
This sounds very intense. I'm going to put you on the spot here. Can you
Sure.
get specific and share with us just a snippet or an example of someone you actually worked with? What it
Okay.
looked like, they came to you for X reason and blah, blah, blah.
Mhm. Would be a good example. I mean, God, there's so many. There's some like what would be I work with people that have like satanic ritual abuse and stuff like that too. So really intense trauma from infancy, all the way up to people that are, pretty trauma light. But I guess one common thing that I work with would be sexual abuse. What I've noticed in working with women for 25 years is I would say about 90% of them have some kind of sexual violation, either, early or teenager or whatever. So that's a really common theme. So the first thing that I do is I do establishing safe touch. And I'm a big proponent of touch in a session, because especially with developmental trauma, what was missing was safe touch.
Right.
And of course, I understand why most therapeutic, university, whatever, they just pull it out. Just
Right.
don't do it. And, of course, you don't want people fondling each other, and it makes sense. But it also, because like I was saying, we're working with the biology. I'm working with the how's your body holding that? And that, just even holding somebody from the side or their hand on their back to give them support can really get the trauma moving and get it, and also containment. And so the first thing I want to do is establish safe touch with somebody. And so I do this whole boundary exercise where they're in charge and they're like, okay, come a little closer. Oh, back up. Okay, what are you feeling? Ooh, okay, go get lower, and then check in. How are they feeling? And with some people that are highly, highly traumatized, it took 2 years to establish safe touch, where we could just do this after 2 years. That's how many boundary violations they had as a youngster. But usually with most people, it takes like a session or half a session or maybe 2 or whatever, depending. And then, once we've established safe touch, if it was a medicine session, say, they would start talking about, what they remember of those sexual violations. And one thing I bring in too, just in somatic therapy, they talk a lot about corrective experiences. So you're what you want to do is go into the imprint and then bring in what was missing, so that it shifts the way that your system's holding it. So one thing that I just kind of figured out along the way that I've never learned anywhere else is this, to go into like a protector mode. So when the person's going into like, oh my God, the perpetrator's coming and I can hear and they're coming in my room and they're, and then I would come in and I would get them to like scream or something, like, okay, call out for help, or they'd be help. And then I'd come in and be like, what the hell are you doing? And I'd push, pretend to, push the perpetrator out the door, get the fuck out of here, and you leave her alone. And then, close the door and then check, like, are you okay? Like, and they're, and then I would comfort them and, kind of, so you're kind of rewriting the way that the imprint was held, by being the competent protector. That's a very big intervention with sexual abuse. And, and then we just go through the layer, often then a big shame wave will come up. And, a lot of what people don't realize about shame, like shame and fear, the way I understand them, is that they're neural states. They're not emotions. Emotions is like midbrain, limbic stuff, like anger, sadness, whatever, jealousy. Fear and shame are brainstem, survival, right? Fight and flight is the fear, and the freeze or the play dead is shame. And I call it biological shame, because it's the mechanism the biology uses to like numb out sensation and shut, because the nervous energy is like high energy, and if you get too much, it blows the circuit, right? Just like you plugged in too many things into an outlet in your house, and it's gonna blow the circuit. And that's the biological shame coming in to shut it down, so that to protect the system from overload. So I work a lot with like getting people to go into the shame. I call it a shame freeze. It's characterized by like kind of a tightening and a numbing and a bit of a spacing out. And then I come in like and actually break up the shame freeze physically and I have a.
And is this during like a medicine session?
Any session.
Okay.
Yeah, could be a medicine session. The medicine session is nice because it's longer. You have enough time to really, like, the thing about the hour and a half every week, or even an hour every week, you're just starting to get into it, and you can do a little piece, and then they're gone, and then you do a little piece and a little. But with the 7 hours, you can go like layer and layer and and you can get to the core of stuff that you might never get to in 20 years if you're just kind of doing the top layer over and over again. So it has a lot of advantages as far as being able to kind of stay with some, especially with attachment stuff, because to rewire attachment stuff, you're actually changing the wiring in your neural architecture. So that's hard to do with just talking, And then the other benefit of the medicine, the psychedelics or the pathogens, most of the medicines, they increase neuroplasticity. So the interventions that you do have a bigger impact on their, like it actually, you can, especially if you have enough time, you can rewire the way that the attachment system is wired up. But you can't do that in an hour. It needs like prolonged exposure to like a loving container with the neuroplasticity and the relational healing part. Because those are really hard to shift, attachment dynamics. Like anyone that's tried to shift them, like, you know, there's some great mapping out of, you know, the anxious avoidant and all these things, but like, how do you heal it is where it always, well, you got to be in a secure relationship for 5 years to really, you know, shift it. But like, if you have it's really hard to maintain a relationship long enough to heal it, you know? So I want to shout from the mountain, like the combination of pathogens in a 7-hour session with co-therapists, we can actually start to rewire the way the attachment wiring is configured without having to do it in a long-term relationship, which is really exciting because so many people are stuck in that those relational patterns that are, you know, hard to change. Yeah.
What does it take for someone like yourself to do this work? I mean, this sounds so intense to me because, well, I mean, the medicines in and of themselves just seem so intense, right? To what degree? I mean, is it safe to say there's some part like you don't know what's going to happen?
Yeah. When I'm teaching courses, and, you know, because it's a little bit trendy almost, like, I want to be a psychedelic therapist. And, you know, I've done acid a few times. I could sit with people or whatever. And, you know, it's kind of a bit of a wild west in the sort of underground psychedelic theme. So when I'm teaching a course, you know, the first thing I say is, this is not for the faint of heart. And I tell them a few horror stories, like not horror stories, but like, a common thing for me, you know, in the beginning was, and this is one of the mistakes I didn't know, was that, you know, you do a 7-hour pathogen session with deep somatic early imprint processing. Like, it doesn't just end at 5 o'clock. The person's still going all night. And the pathogens are also, they all have an amphetamine base to them. So you're kind of wired, but then you're coming down and you're feeling kind of shitty but you've torn the lid off of like a trauma. And so I would get people at midnight knocking on my door, like, I'm still freaking out, like I need help. Or so that's why I started to bring in this aftercare piece, so that to avoid those types of situations. And people, they, you know, it can open up a trauma, and people can like, all of a sudden they're projecting you as the perpetrator. You gave me too much medicine and now I'm all messed up, and it's your fault. And, you know, it can get like ugly. Even if you do everything right, you know, you haven't done anything wrong there. You know, you can unearth, you know, I've had this where a woman remembered that sexual abuse, and that the perpetrator was her dad. And she was like 21 or something, and it completely destroyed the relationship. Like she was not ready to remember that at that time, or, well, right. I don't know if she was, it took the memory amnesia away, and she remembered it, and it made her life hell for like 3 years, you know, and it's still hard. Yeah. So I don't know if, like, for some people, they'd want to remember that, to kind of go, oh, no wonder I had an eating disorder and I feel so messed up all the time, and I'm confused in my relationships. I disorganized attachment. You know, it makes everything make sense, but it's also devastating. You know? So it's not for the faint of heart. And I've worked up to, you know, it's like kind of like training for a marathon. Yeah. Where I've worked up to being able to do a 7-hour session, because it's a lot of, it's tiring. Yeah.
And what is within that, working up to that point, what does that take for you? I mean, not obviously experience, but
yeah, I think the number one thing for me is doing my own work, and receiving a lot of sessions where I'm in the client role and I'm taking a medicine, and I have my apprentices or somebody, you know, helping me, and trying different medicines, and really getting familiar with the scope of the field. And then I tend to only mainly work with, I don't work with the psilocybin. And I mean, there is a beautiful use of psilocybin where if someone's fairly trauma light, they can take a whopping dose, like 7 grams, and they can have these mystical experience, transcendent, magical experiences that can really shift the way you see spirituality and the way you see your life, and it can help you orient towards a more fulfilling. You get visions, and there is that application of more the visionary part of it with the plant medicines. But what I find if people are fairly trauma heavy and they take a huge dose like that, their trauma just comes up. They don't have a nice, pleasant, vision. They actually just get really scared, and you have to just process fear and shame and terror and whatever. And also being out of control for someone that's a lot of trauma, that's terrifying. Because to them, out of control means you're getting hurt or you're not safe, or so it depends how much trauma you have to which medicine you want to apply and what their intention is and all of that.
Wow. Okay. So currently you are working in one capacity. We mentioned Nectara. You working with them?
Yeah, well, this summer I filmed a masterclass actually talking about relational somatic therapy and bringing psychedelics into one's practice and how those. Well, it's mostly I'm exploring the physiology of trauma in the masterclass. So Nectara was the ones that produced it, and then I just showed up and gave the teachings, and then they've put it onto their online platform, which is a online platform for people that are doing psychedelic work, and maybe people can feel very disintegrated after a session. They might need more integration, so they have these integration circles on there, and just it's a place you can kind of connect with other people that are on a similar path. And then I'm posting things about trauma resolution on there, and the master classes on there, and so it's a resource for not only people doing psychedelics, but also people that are into trauma resolution and kind of those two worlds, how they come together.
Okay. And aside from that, what's the best way for someone to get in touch with you and learn about the work you do?
Through nectara.co would be right now my practice is so full, I'm not really taking new clients. If there are therapists listening to this, they might be interested in the course, which is the Somatic Psychedelic Therapy training. So it's a 2 6-day retreats with experientials that we do. So we actually work with a medicine, so you can see how it feels. Like I was saying, for me, like the most important thing is doing one's own work. Yep. I started doing my own work around 25 years ago, and I'm still, it's unending. And there's always these blind spots that, you think you kind of got everything, and then some blind spot comes out. And so the most important thing, because you have to have a lot of integrity to do this work. You have to really, and your heart has to be in the right place, and you have to be careful. And so it's really important. Especially once, like what I found is, I did this master class and I started teaching classes. It's easy to become a target for, people that disagree with your views on, this cancel culture thing. Anyways, as you go along. And that's where, so if you do have a blind spot, even a tiny one, it's going to, and you're a teacher or you're, it can really be can get you into trouble, like not that you'd want to, but so this continually working on oneself, that's what I'm always telling the other therapists, like don't stop that. It's unending, and there's always more to discover and work with.
Where do people learn about the course you just mentioned?
So the best would be if they sent an email to Nectara and asked to get the info, and then I could put them on my list. And then when I send out I do it twice a year.
Okay.
Spring and fall. Yeah.
And for those therapists who are listening and who maybe are really interested in what you're talking about here, could you recommend any books to get them started?
Yeah. Oh gosh, what's it called? Well, the two books that I recommend, one is called Hold On to Your Kids by Gordon Neufeld and Gabor Mate. And it's all about attachment parenting.
Okay.
And, I learned a lot about parenting, but also how to work with clients, because that seems to be, it's just like where they didn't get parented properly, they need to get reparented in a sense, like what was missing. I'm trying to fill that in. So Hold On to Your Kids. And then Sharon Stanley has a book called, Relational and Something Practices for Healing Trauma.
Yeah,
but if you look
amazing.
up, do you know that book?
She's been on the podcast a few times. She's
okay. Yeah. So that her book is probably the most resonant with the work that I'm teaching. Yeah.
Awesome. All right, Sasha, man, crazy, just really intense and fascinating, and really informative. I want to thank you for coming on here, man. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It's delightful to meet you and to connect. And I'm really glad you're bringing this information to the world, because it's so key. Yeah. And the old systems haven't really updated the trauma is anyways. So it's really good that it's getting out there. So thank you for the work that you do.
You're welcome. We'll be in touch. We'll bring you back on.
Awesome. I would love that.
All right, brother. Take care.
All right. Thanks, Guy.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much for listening and supporting this podcast. And if you'd like to join the hundreds of other therapists who are each month keeping up to date and informed and inspired about what's going on in the world of trauma, I'd love to invite you to head on over to the Trauma Therapist newsletter. That's the traumatherapistnewsletter.com.